Andy Matzner, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Oh, thank you, David, for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, last time you were here, we spoke about your book on creative and therapeutic uses of Tarot.
Yes.
And so how does a nice Tarot reader / licensed clinical social worker like yourself come to write a book about recovering from addictions and compulsive behavior?
Well, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I have several answers to
we've got lots of time.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I do is teach as an adjunct professor here in Virginia.
Good for you.
Community College. Thank you. I love teaching. I would say, and I teach in the social work. Well, I teach students who are going to become social workers mostly, as well as abnormal psychology. And what I discovered is so many of my students themselves are dealing with addictions or compulsive behaviors. So, especially for future social workers, figuring out while they're in school how to get a handle on those things are very, very important. So that certainly over the last several years has been something in the forefront of my consciousness. But not only that, up until recently, spent about 3 years in what we call the VASAP program here in Virginia. When a person has a DUI, or if they're busted for their driving and they're high on marijuana, one of the things that the judge might sentence them to will be mandatory classes, 18 weeks of treatment class. So they're not in jail. They don't have their licenses typically anymore, but they have to make their way to these groups, and that's what they are. They're these drug treatment groups, and going through that experience, and really listening to people who, and by the time the groups that I was leading, these groups weren't for first timers. By the time they got to my groups, they'd been arrested for DUIs once, twice, or even 3 times already. So these were people who prior groups hadn't helped. They hadn't been able to get their drinking or marijuana use under control. And it really made me think about, well, what does it mean to recover? What are we doing in our therapeutic community to help people really get a handle on their addictions, on their compulsive behaviors? And the cool thing, which led to the book that I wrote about addictions and compulsive behavior and recovery, is that my classes became a laboratory for me to try different ideas out in. They resonated. That was the beautiful thing, is that some of the ideas I had about recovery did resonate with my members of the groups.
Yeah, so the book really grew out of that work. And I have a copy of the book right here so that those who are watching our video, which will be on YouTube. So I'm holding up the cover. It's kind of a large format paperback with, almost 200 pages. Yeah, so a lot of value here. The title is Recovery from Addictions and Compulsive Behavior, a journaling-based guide to becoming your best self and having a life worth living. And so we're going to be digging down into that. So I take it that this book, I plan to ask you a personal question, and maybe it's not relevant, of whether or not addiction or compulsive behavior was something that you had struggled with. Because a lot of times that's where books come from.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, and I've written, I've had one book published by a traditional publisher about transgenderism in Thailand, and actually working as a gender therapist is one of my specialties. But what I like about writing books, and really what allows me to put out a book, and I'll talk about my connection with this topic in particular, but I use CreateSpace, and I love the fact that I can think about a topic and use writing a book as a way to organize my thoughts. And then instead of waiting years for it to come out in print, through Amazon, I can have it out in print almost immediately once I've written it, and have it available for clients and for the general public. But this in particular,
Let me just pause you 1 second. You mentioned something called Create Space. Is that an app or what?
that's actually I guess you would say it's the publishing arm of Amazon,
Oh,
where if you have a PDF file, you can upload it and it turns into a book, basically. And that's free. You would, and it's available on Amazon throughout the world.
and so they would take a cut of whatever sales you have?
Exactly. So that's how they make their money. And so for me, it's a very democratic process in terms of people getting their knowledge out into the world and sharing it with others. So my tarot book was done through them. I wrote a book about the hero's journey and recovering from mental illness, book about emotional eating. I've had a number of books that I published through Create Space. And I just, then it's up to the author as far as publicizing it and promoting it.
Uh-huh.
But it is free, and that's what I like about it. If someone has a book in them, there's really nothing really in the way in terms of getting it out there.
I mostly have book guilt in me rather than a book. Guilt about the book that I'm not writing. But that's a different topic. So you were about to tell us more about your connection to the topic of addiction and compulsive behavior.
Yeah, I think for me, and it's interesting because I think my own personal experience connects with the one size does not fit all perspective in terms of compulsive behavior recovery. And certainly, we know about the disease model. We're born with an addictive personality versus it being learned behavior. For me, I would say food has been an interesting part of my life. And I have a sweet tooth. It's hard. I mean, I'm the kind of, I could, if I wanted to, not that I would, but certainly if I wanted to, I could literally eat a whole box of cookies or an entire cake. I just, that to me is doable versus my wife, for example, who does not have a sweet tooth. The joke is, we can buy a box of cookies and I'll finish it off in a day and she'll take 6 months to finish it. And she's been a good teacher for me. But what's interesting to me is I've discovered that when I'm eating enough protein, cravings I have for carbohydrates go away. It's as simple as that.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, for me, working and so, AA and NA are pushed very heavily in the SA, the substance abuse community, and certainly where I was working for those several years, that was a big thing. You need to go to AA. And I think for me, what's so powerful is knowing that so many of us have different relationships with particular things that perhaps are not as healthy as they could be, whether it's alcohol or food, eating. And that was the thing. I would eat when I wasn't hungry just because I would have this craving and it would be hard to stop. It could be with the internet, with pornography, with drugs, whatever. We have a relationship and it doesn't empower us. It doesn't serve us. What I think is so fascinating and liberating, but it's also difficult to put into practice is that I think each one of us has our own healing path towards recovery when it comes to compulsive behavior or addiction. And because AA is free and because there's a meeting every hour of the day, 7 days a week, the AA model becomes our go-to, that disease model. And what I discovered for myself is, this relationship with carbs, with food, with sweets changed because of something nutritional. And when I worked with the members of my groups and also with clients and my students, what I discovered, which, plenty of people know, but it bears repeating, because certainly it's not being paid attention to, at least down, in the trenches, is that when it comes to recovery from an addiction or compulsive behavior, we have to really focus on the person individually, which can be a pain in the butt, because if I have a group of 20 people who are all court mandated for 18 weeks to go through this program, it's easier for me to lecture at them with this one size fits all
Mm-hmm.
and talk about alcoholism or drug use as a disease, and the solution is AA or NA, as opposed to figuring out for each person why they initially started developing that relationship with a behavior, a compulsive behavior, gambling, sex, or with a substance.
What I think I hear you saying is that as widespread as AA and NA are, that it's not necessarily the right choice for everyone.
Exactly. For some people, it is the right choice. I'm certainly not anti-AA. I find, though, that the AA model of you're born an addict and you'll die an addict, in my experience, the idea that you are going to relapse, that you can't, you're always going to have this very dysfunctional relationship with alcohol.
Yeah.
It gives people an excuse to relapse, is what I found, because that's what addicts do. Addicts and alcoholics relapse. And my challenge for my group members was to figure out, how can you get to a place where it simply doesn't make sense anymore to have that relationship with alcohol, to where you can go into a bar and you can also, you can drink socially, which is anathema, right? That's, heresy for someone in
Right, right.
But for me, what I was discovering is that people were using alcohol for for reasons that made sense. If someone had been abused as a kid and they were having nightmares, drinking to black themselves out, to get to sleep and to stay asleep, it made sense that alcohol became their drug of choice. And so for me, the issue was not going to AA, but trauma work, dealing with trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So that they didn't need that tool anymore. And certainly, I know that our bodies become dependent to alcohol. So there's that piece. But I thought, AA, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, basically. And
yeah, right. Yeah. I just recently interviewed somebody on compassion-focused therapy.
Yes.
And boy, something you said just triggered that. Now I may have lost it. Maybe it'll come back to me. Something you said was so specific to that, and yeah, I've really lost it. Sorry, audience.
Well, can I tell you? What's funny, and listening to that podcast of yours, I thought that was really interesting, because what I discovered from the members of my BASAP groups was that so many of their prior group leaders who had bought into the AA model, here we are in 2014, 15, 16, we still have people who are very confrontational when it comes to, which we know doesn't work. If you confront someone who has a drinking problem and say, if you don't admit you have a problem, you're in denial. You do have a problem, you need to go to AA, you need to be like this or that. So many of my group members were telling me that they would walk out of groups with these other instructors feeling like dirt, feeling like they had been judged,
mm-hmm.
like they had been invalidated, and it actually made them want to go drink. And so for me, this idea of compassion, having compassion for the people we're working really for, I'm working for my clients, for the people in this group to get better and to recover. So not seeing them as someone in denial, but seeing how they've chosen to drink or use drugs for good reasons, for reasons that make sense. And so because they're in pain, typically, some sort of pain, psychic pain,
right,
soul pain, physical pain. So what can I do to help them figure out a way to not depend on that substance, and then be their partner, not be a parent saying you're bad. And so for me, and I write about that in the book, this idea of compassion, and also helping them develop self-compassion, because they've been taught you're a piece of junk because you're an alcoholic.
Right. Yeah. Your book is really a journaling-based workbook.
Yes.
And I was going to ask you what led you to that approach, but now I think I know. Probably these were assignments in the group.
Exactly. This was a way for me to structure the curriculum and get people thinking, just really provide a space for people to examine their lives in a way that typically, it's interesting. A lot of the clients, I live in Roanoke, which is a small city in Southwest Virginia, but where I was doing these VASAP groups was about an hour southwest, not far from Virginia Tech, right? And here we are celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the school shooting, right? That mass shooting 10 years ago at Virginia Tech. So I had plenty of students, but it's a very rural area. Many of my clients, and I had all ages and all walks of life, but many people who living on farms, living out in the country, an interesting mix, but many of them never had the opportunity or never really thought about making use of therapy, introspection on a level that I think, as a therapist or therapists, we think, wow, this is important stuff. Everybody should have an opportunity to, do some introspective work. And I would say 99% of those group members hadn't had that opportunity.
All right.
And whether it's financial or just they weren't interested. And so for me, providing the space over 10 weeks or 18 weeks in which, and my goal was to create a safe space, make it not call anybody out, do a lot of private work or small partnering work with people, but we really got to know each other and just explore, why am I the way that I am? What is it that I believe about myself and the world? What are my values? How am I honoring my values through my life? What am I an example of? Just, exploring self-talk, spirituality, just all these things that typically my clients, they're not going to be exposed to. And they're forced, here they're court mandated to be in this group, 90 minutes every week for 10 or 18 weeks. And I thought, this is a great opportunity for people to, the silver lining of the sentence to come to my group was that, hey, they're going to learn who they are and hopefully walk out of there feeling that because they're more self-aware, they have more control over the choices they make in their lives.
You would think that people who are court mandated to, you must go take this experience, that they would come in very resistant and maybe angry and wanting to act out in various ways.
Yes.
But it sounds like somehow you were able to get through that phase and really draw them in somehow.
Well, that was, I love groups. And as a teacher, that's what my classes are. They're groups and therapeutic groups. And one of my internships as a social work student was in the Veterans Hospital here. It was an inpatient PTSD unit where they were doing psychodrama, which is incredible. I was blessed to witness a gentleman named Joe Duell, who's a trainer in psychodrama. And for me, the power of a group in creating a sense of safety so people could be vulnerable and enact the traumas. And so you're absolutely right. People come into my group pissed off because not only do they know where they're going to be spending the next 18 weeks, and a lot of them, it's a real inconvenience because their licenses often are gone. There was one guy who lived out in the boonies. He had to bicycle. It was 20 miles on a bike, and rain or shine. And so just getting there is difficult. And then they're paying. Not only did they have to pay a huge, I think, $400 court fine, but and this was the weird thing, which I wish they didn't do, but every time they came to group, they're paying me $15. So, which to me, kind of mixing money plus the therapeutic process in that way isn't ideal. But, people are sitting, with their arms crossed. They, it's my toughest crowd, right? They want to be anywhere in the world but there.
Yeah.
So I love that challenge. Though my challenge, in the beginning of the 3 years or so, I discovered immediately that my challenge was to create a space in which people felt like I wasn't going to judge them, where they could be safe, and because what I said was, look, we have to share this space together. Let's make the most of it. let me do something. The way that I framed it was, my goal is for everyone to walk out of here in 4 months with skills that they can use, that you guys can use, that will be practical, that will improve the quality of your life. And that was how I sold it to people. Not, I'm going to lecture you every week and we're going to watch videos. This is your brain on drugs. This is what alcohol does to you. They're all experts on that already. They know.
Yeah.
So that was the thing, is that I also never asked people why they were there, because a lot of other instructors, it's the shame game. Why are you here? Going around. I very much told them straight up, I don't care why you're here. The fact is, you're here. I'm here. This is power with. This is not power over me on this power trip. I'm here because I care about you. And again, I want to help you improve the quality of your life. And I think when people heard me say that and they realized they weren't going to be judged or put on the spot or have someone wag their finger at them, their resistance melted away, because they knew that I cared. And that did it. That did it day one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good for you.
Oh, thanks. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, your book is sort of journaling based. That is, there are a lot of exercises in which people are invited to reflect about a topic and write about it. And was there sharing of that writing in the group, or was it totally personal?
It would depend.
Private?
And in the beginning, I did a lot of ice breaking. It's always, the number one rule is, well, besides confidentiality, which, you can't really enforce, but nobody would have to share who didn't want to share.
Right.
But I did, knowing that I had either 10 weeks or more often 18 weeks with this group, I would spend the beginning doing lots of icebreakers. I wanted people to get to know each other. And as people got to know each other, they felt more comfortable sharing aspects of their lives with each other. So sometimes, depending on the issue, because I never wanted someone to feel that they were being put on the spot, depending on the issue, I would do, okay, as a group, whoever wants to share, let's talk about these issues. Sometimes I would break people up into pairs and they could share or not with each other. I did a lot of just, this is private for your eyes only. No one else is going to see this. And the way that I framed it was, which I thought really helped, this is a chance to be honest with yourself. This is a moment, because so many people are busy, and they're struggling to work, to keep their jobs, families, just all sorts of drama. I would say most of my clients, because of the legal system, were lower income. So, they're struggling. So to have this time carved out every week in which they could be honest with themselves as they're writing, to me, that was sacred. So, so certainly a lot of private reflection as well.
Okay. You and I have a lot in common, I think, in terms of this approach that you're describing. You said you bring it to bear in your teaching as well. That's how I taught. I felt some responsibility, because it was university, to deliver didactic content, but a lot of it was very process oriented, generally 50-50. So some presentation, and then a lot of work in small groups. Journaling was a key piece of it, particularly in dream classes. I've been keeping a dream journal off and on for years and years. And so I really know what a powerful process that can be in getting people to open up, and, as you say, using icebreakers and so on. Your book targets addictions and compulsive behavior.
Yes.
Are they the same thing?
I don't, well, and I know people, as you know, and listening to all the guests that you have on your podcast, and I just want you to know,
a faithful listener.
Yes, and I assign my classes also to listen, to choose a podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. Listen, thank you. And the transcripts that you have as well, where I just, I feel that it's an incredible read. My students come in to my abnormal psych class thinking psychology is, they don't even know, if they haven't been to therapy, even if they've been to therapy, they don't know really the depth that certainly interviewing, the 500 and change people that you've interviewed. So I love the fact that people can explore all the facets that you offer.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why it's an assignment. They got to go through and pick something that resonates with them and listen to it, or read the transcript. But for me, but that being said, there's so many perspectives on, what is addiction, the biological piece, the environmental piece, compulsivity. To answer your question, I always go back to, and I'm very much a Jungian. I mean, I love that Jungian idea that, our symptoms are messengers from our psyches, our souls. So we have to pay attention to the message that they're giving us. So for me, addiction, compulsive behavior, it goes back to a relationship. So I'm having a relationship with alcohol or to whatever, to hand washing, to spending hours on, playing video games. So are they this, and that's a good question. I think for me personally, I go back to, is this relationship that I'm having with something empowering or disempowering? Knowing that certainly if it's a substance, my brain chemistry and my body chemistry is being changed in a way that certainly has to be dealt with when I change my relationship with that substance. But also knowing that if I'm engaged in a behavior, my brain chemistry, my body chemistry is also changing when I'm thinking about doing it and then doing it and then afterwards. So you can't even separate that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm always thinking in terms of what kind of relationship do I have with X and what's the nature of it?
It's interesting. The question that you ask yourself and them is this empowering or not empowering? And that's an interesting way to come at it. And by the way, the thought that I lost,
yes,
that was triggered, that brought to mind the compassion focus therapy interview that I'd done. You said something about trauma, and the person who I had interviewed about that said that in his experience, it seemed like just about everybody suffers from trauma. At least of the patients, whether they come, it may not be called PTSD, but he said that most of us who do seek out therapy have had some pretty heavy things happen during our childhood. That kind of approaches trauma. So that was the thought that was lost. I'm glad to reclaim it.
Well, and I'm glad you did, because that, and I think before we become therapists, we don't realize the amount of trauma in the world. And, we might be aware of our own, but I think for me, becoming a teacher, because part of what I have to do is I ask my students, so what brought you, why are you interested in becoming a social worker? And for so many of them, it's because of their own mental health background.
Sure.
And so discovering, and people will write reflective essays on this. And so I would say at least 80% of my students and have some sort of a background.
Yeah.
And then it was the same thing as I learned more about the group members in the VASAP program, so many of them had some form of trauma in their lives. And so for me, it goes back to, so as human beings, how do we cope with trauma? And so for me, the tragedy is that we often, we see addicts, so we just see the addiction. This person's an addict, they're an alcoholic, but we're not thinking about, there are so many people walking around with trauma. As a society, what do we have in place to help people process that? And I'll tell you, 80% of the people in my VASAP groups were men. And it's funny because in my college classes, 80% of the people are women going into social.
Right.
So, And I would say 80% of them are complete people pleasers. They're all about helping other people and ignoring their own needs. And then it was the opposite with the members of my the alcohol and drug groups, where, you know, as tough guys, no matter how old they were, old, young, this idea of introspection or asking for help or thinking about the fact that I was abused or traumatized, or experienced incredible losses as a child, or continuing to experience losses, that I should actually do something about it versus just suck it up. And so connecting behavior that wasn't serving them with past trauma, and that they might not realize the connection between those things, I think was very powerful, because once group members started to recognize that, and because they felt safe, you know, they realized how important it was to actually process through all the losses and traumas that they had experienced. Because I think typically, if you don't get court mandated, you know, a lot of these men, mostly, they were always going to go through their lives without paying attention to what they had experienced and the impact that was continuing to have on them.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think it was in high school, maybe college, where I learned and started to say, everybody has a story.
Yes.
And what I'm realizing now in this conversation is that we didn't talk about trauma in those days. That was not a word, or PTSD hadn't even been invented yet.
Right.
And I think what I was responding to, what I was resonating with, was that as I got to know people and hear their story, I would see that there was pain in there. And that was something that would be kind of a bonding thing, because I had my own pain. I thought my story was the most important story in the world. And I held it. I've only recently begun to let go. I haven't totally let go, but this sort of this precious thing, you know, my story, as if I was the only one who had a special life and a special story. And what I discovered was, hey, that's pretty much everybody that's walking around.
I agree.
Yeah, and the good piece of it is it can be a bridge between us to connect.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why I love narrative therapy. I mean, that, you know, listening to you and thinking, yes, that's, you know, narrative therapy, this idea that every person has a story worth that deserves a witness to it. That's what I love about therapy, right? Is we get to become that witness to someone's story and figure out perhaps where they might be going, and is their story empowering, or there are different stories that we have, you know.
Yeah.
Is our story empowering? Which parts of it are disempowering? But I love what you said, because I think that was the issue with other instructors, is that, you know, everyone looks the same. You know, you're an alcoholic, you're an addict. That's how I see you. That's how I'm going to interact with you, versus you're this very complicated, deep person who's experienced all sorts of stuff, right? By the time that here you are in front of me. And so how can we honor that? You know, how can we honor the stories of our clients in a way that makes our clients feel that their life hasn't been random, and that actually, what I love about narrative therapy is the idea that a lot of us were given our stories. And that's why I love Carl Jung, that idea that, you know, the greatest burden of the child is the unlived life of the parent, you know? And so thinking about how our lives have been shaped by other people's stories, and where has that led us? And if our lives aren't working, maybe we can learn how to take control of our own narrative. And certainly for my clients, like I said, a lot of whom were from a lower socioeconomic class, that idea that their stories were worth telling, worth being heard, is very empowering, I think.
Is there racial diversity in that population as well?
You know, that's a great question. Rural Southwest Virginia, again, 80-20, I'd say about 80% of the people in my group were Caucasian, 20% African-American.
Okay. And you've been using an acronym, BASEF or BASEP or
Oh, yes.
Yeah, what does that stand for?
It's the Virginia Alcohol and Substance Abuse Program. So VASAP.
Okay, VASAP. And you had a job in that program, did you say for 3 years?
Yeah, for about 3 years. So I was leading groups for that. And that's the program where people get slotted into when a judge sentences them to an education or a treatment class because of a DUI.
Yeah.
Or a drug-related driving incident.
Yeah. Is there an underlying, I think a lot of this has come through in what you've said already, but I had planned to ask you if there's an underlying philosophy of treatment or philosophy of change that underlies this book and your work.
Well, that's a great question, because I think the idea of how and why do people change is so important.
Yeah.
And I think as people in the mental health field, we have to be really clear ourselves on, okay, so what is my philosophy of change? How do people change? Why do people change? And that wonderful paradox, and I talk about it in the book, you can't, it's when we accept ourselves as we are that we can begin to change. And so in the book, I deliberately, and I do this when I work with people with emotional eating, and also the hero's journey, so narrative therapy, really doing an inventory of where they've come from and understanding how their past has led to the present. And I think when a person can make peace with that and understand that, that gives them a really nice foundation then to ask, okay, well, in light of this understanding I have now about who I am and why I've made the choices I've made to, the best of my ability. Okay. So now what? Where do I want to go? If, like Dr. Phil says, how's your life working for you? And if you can't say it's working great, okay, so something needs to change. So I think for me, I love motivational interviewing because when people have that epiphany on their own, I love journaling because I give people questions. Mm-hmm. I don't tell them, so think and ruminate. So when people on their own, it's like I provide the fertilizer, and ideally on their own, they discover, you know what, I'm not willing to keep going down this path, and I want to create some changes in my life. At which point I have to say, because it's the courage piece. I have to say what I've learned is the Serenity Prayer is such a cornerstone to my, I think, treatment philosophy, where I've observed, even in my own life, that so many of us, the Serenity Prayer, higher power, grant me the serenity to accept what I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So many of us mix those things up, where we're banging our heads against the wall, trying to change something that we have to accept, and then believing that we have no power over something that actually we do. And so what I loved about the groups I was leading is that I could assist people or empower people to make peace with things that they had no control over anymore, usually from their past or present, but then also tap into their courage to start making those changes that they actually believe erroneously they could never do, like leaving a relationship or leaving a job or going back to school or quitting drugs or drinking. I mean, that's so, for me, the Serenity Prayer is, it's like everyone should have that tattooed on their forearm.
Yeah. And that's interesting. Doesn't that come from the 12-step? Isn't that a basic part of the 12-step program? And so even though you were saying that, yes, you didn't think it was the path for everybody, you want this part of it tattooed on the arm. Okay.
Yeah. I'll take, 12-step, I love their slogans, they've, and there's, again, the research shows that 12-step works for, 10 to 15% of the population. There's some, I love the idea of a sponsor. I love the idea of community. I love the idea that I can call someone any time of day or night and they're going to support me. And I find that I cherry pick from different philosophies.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm guilty.
Okay. So how do you envision people using this book that you've written
Mm.
who are not in the program, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
kind of put this out into the world and
Yes. Well, the subtitle is, and I've got, because it's a mouthful, Journaling-Based Guide to Becoming Your Best Self and Having a Life Worth Living. You know, my idea was, you know, life is too short for us not to be able to figure out how to become our best selves. You know, how can I reach a point where I feel like I've done or I'm doing the work I need to be doing to really figure out who I am and why I make the choices that I'm making, and how can I fulfill my potential. So this book really is for anybody, because what I found was that path to shedding our addiction or compulsive behavior is actually the same path we take towards fulfilling our kind of to becoming fulfilled as human beings. It's the same. And I think that's the thing that a lot of treatment programs miss, is that when a person can fully individuate, when a person can fully develop themselves in all aspects. So, you know, the chapters in the book that talk about nutrition and exercise and spirituality and volunteering, you know, helping others, being of service. You know, what are my core values? What are my limiting beliefs? Do I know how to self-soothe? You know, what's my relationship with my emotions? Self-compassion, learning self-compassion. I mean, those are skills that I think should be taught in middle school, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Right? So it's really a guidebook to life. And I find that when we focus our time on becoming the best version of ourselves, especially the self-compassion piece, as well as what are my core values and am I living, what's getting in the way of me living a life in alignment with my core values, I think that not only do we become really fulfilled and satisfied with our lives, but then compulsive behavior, addictions start to not make sense anymore, because I don't have that hole. And it's funny because, again, my thing is, my relationship with protein, go figure, right? But it really changed that feeling of never being able to fill that hole, which I know a lot of people talk about on that metaphorical soul level, is that I'm trying to fill this hole in my psyche and I can never do it. So, for example, a relationship with spirituality, you know, a relationship with serving others, those are wonderful ways to find meaning in life. And I think, you know, it's Viktor Frankl, you know, that idea that when we know why we're here and we're connected with our purpose, then we're willing to make very different choices in our lives than when we're not connected to those things. And that's what the book is aiming to do, is to help people through journaling. So, you know, expressive arts therapy, basically, to think about those things so that it simply doesn't make sense anymore to treat themselves poorly or to do something that's going to take them away from their core mission in life.
You know, I'm interested in the protein now.
Yes.
Had you been a vegetarian and not getting enough protein or something? Or when you talk about getting more protein, does that mean you're taking protein powder, or does that mean that you're eating steak every night? Tell us about that. I'm interested in the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, and so that's a great question, because, again, everyone is different. For me, I've actually... it's funny because I like to juice, so I'm a big proponent, and I'm not a vegetarian, so I like meat. I'm very lucky though, because even though I live in Southwest Virginia, a very rural area, relatively speaking, so it's not necessarily very cosmopolitan, we have access here to many farms, and farmers markets. So I'm able to get meat where I know the farmer, you know, I know where my meat is coming from. So I feel comfortable eating, beef, pork, chicken, that sort of thing. So what I discovered though, when my juicer broke, I started doing smoothies. And I have this protein powder. I exercise and I've got this protein powder. It's plant-based. But I was making smoothies with avocados and spinach. And I decided to do kind of a semi-smoothie fast. So I was eating maybe one big meal and a couple of smoothies with protein. And it's so interesting because even though I wouldn't say I was eating a lot of protein before, but once I jumped up to having two smoothies of about 20 grams of protein. So there's your nitty gritty, 20 grams of plant-based protein.
Each smoothie?
Each smoothie. So, and I also drink raw milk. So again, very lucky here in Virginia. I know it's legal in California. Here in Virginia, you have to actually buy a share of a cow to get your raw milk. But one of my raw, my smoothies would be with raw milk and the protein powder, the other with hemp milk. But what was fascinating to me was as the weeks went by and I had added basically this extra protein shake smoothie to my diet, my craving for carbs went away. And, is this a controlled experiment? Well, no, not yet. Certainly I could stop and see if it returned. But, I'd heard other friends in the past talk about how they noticed when they were eating more protein that their cravings for certain sweets would go away. And so it's, for me, it's this idea that, we're all guinea pigs and I'm going to try, here I am trying something and here's what I'm noticing. So that's what I've noticed. And I really haven't changed anything else in my diet, except basically cutting out one meal and replacing it with that smoothie protein shake.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for being willing to go into that in some detail. I've had my own dance with protein and, people might have the idea that, that if this is a book of journaling and exercises, that's all that it is. But actually, there's a lot of sort of solid didactic material in here. And you alluded to some of it, but maybe we got time to step through a few of these topics. Of course, the first title that you have there in that regard is How to Change or Not. Yes. That's kind of intriguing, It's like you expect you to come on and say, well, you got my book because you need to change and you're going to change, but you kind of throw in the or not. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I think as you know, we only, and I'm a big proponent of the stages of change. So we're going to change when we're ready to, not before. And I think recognizing that even though I might be ready on a certain level, I'm interested in changing. It's really important not to put pressure on ourselves to change. So I've got that chapter about the nature of change so that we can perhaps treat ourselves more kindly when we don't go full steam ahead into a program. I want people to realize, and part of the book is to create the groundwork, and that's why I like motivational interviewing, to create the groundwork so someone on their own might feel that, okay, now I'm ready. Because I think we often feel pressured. Certainly in my case, doing those substance abuse groups, the idea was you have to change because next time you have a DUI, you're going to go to jail, or prison. You're in real big trouble. So, but I think when we feel forced to change, we dig in our heels and we do resist. So I wanted people to think about the nature of change and not get caught up in, okay, this is something I need to do now. Obviously the book caught my attention, so I'm going to read it, but no pressure. And really that was the same way that I framed it with my group members, as well as my students. It said, hey, this is food for thought.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting right at the outset here. It's really embodies what you've been saying all along, which is a pretty permissive, welcoming kind of process going on. Now, another major topic area for you here that you write about is mindfulness. And it seems like every other interview I do these days, there's something about mindfulness in it. You've heard me talk about that.
Of course.
Yeah. So how do you see the role of mindfulness in terms of your major topic of addiction and compulsive behavior?
Well, I think, for a lot of us, and I, I don't know if I do this as much now. Well, I'm certainly guilty of this. It's easy to use a behavior or a substance to distract ourselves from, a distressing emotion or event. And to go back to AA, something else I'll steal from them is, why do we drink? Halt. If we're hungry, you never want to get hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, because those things will set you up to relapse. And I think it's true. I think that we, make the most out of an addictive behavior or compulsive behavior, because it does help us avoid facing some sort of pain or suffering in the present moment. So I think learning to make peace with and to accept where we are in the present moment is really another cornerstone in becoming that best version of ourselves and changing that dynamic we have within addiction or compulsive behavior. Because as long as we refuse to deal with, what's knocking on the door, I'm angry, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm stressed out, I'm lonely, I hate my job, I want to get a divorce, I want to move. It's so easy to just play that video game or grab that box of cookies. So I think learning that skill of mindfulness allows us to deal with the fear we have of being in that discomfort, of the anxiety, of the depression, of the anger or stress. So for me, if we're going to figure out why we have that addiction or compulsive behavior and then what to do about it, we have to learn how to pay attention and then not judge how we're feeling. Yeah.
So it's the observation and the non-judgment, of non-self-judgment. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which I have to say, another chapter, which I really feel strongly about as far as being didactic, is the chronic pain chapter. Because, this heroin epidemic we're having, which seems to be all over the place in the news, and here where I live, it's officially an epidemic in my small, I live right near West Virginia, the border of West Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Southwest Virginia. So many people are using heroin and overdosing, and the question becomes, why? Well, they were on Oxycontin or for pain. So for me, if we have some people who are not using because of a trauma, but they're using because they're addicted because it's a chronic pain issue, we have to, it's a necessity to figure out, okay, what information can we share with this person that's holistic, that's not medication-based, that will help them deal with their chronic pain? Because, we can get them maybe to kick heroin, but so what? If we take away their coping mechanism and we don't replace it with anything, they're going to be in misery because now they're dealing with this chronic pain. So what I love is that, there are so many ways out there that work for plenty of people to deal with chronic pain that, I love sharing those things. The tragedy is that a lot of insurance won't cover these things, like hypnosis is a good example, or acupuncture. I don't know how it is in California, but in Virginia, a lot of that is not covered. And there are certain things, like I talk about magnets, I think. My mom has awful back pain. For the last 20 years, she's been swearing by putting magnets on those places on her body that feel pain, and it works. And plenty of people will say, that's ridiculous. There have been no studies. It's just, it's crazy. But it works for her. So for me, being able to have a chapter in the book with a menu, to have 20 or 25 different options when it comes to dealing with chronic pain, I feel that that information is integral to someone changing their relationship with, an addiction or compulsive behavior.
Yeah. You know what, as we begin to wind down, I'm just going to read through the topics that you talk about here so people know and be motivated to find out more. So I mentioned how to change or not, mindfulness. I mentioned food and eating, practical considerations. Well, we kind of got into some of that here. Accessing authentic values, being of service, which you mentioned, overcoming maladaptive beliefs, neutralizing negative self-talk, disarming the inner critic, dealing with cravings, managing emotions, dealing with stress, addressing chronic pain, religion, and spirituality. So as you say, this is kind of a handbook for life.
Yeah.
There's nobody who can't use some information and some self-examination in all of those areas.
Yeah.
So as we wind down here, are there any last thoughts that you'd like to leave with? I think you've shared a lot, but maybe there's still something that you'd like to say.
I think for me, and I certainly appreciate this opportunity, to have this conversation with you and to spread the word. But I think, for me, I don't want to ignore spirituality.
Okay.
And that was such a huge issue. Well, it's a huge issue for my students, being a community college. And I'll just do this briefly because I know we're winding down, but so many of my students, they're single mothers. They're working full-time, many of them. So they're single moms working full-time, going to school, either full-time or at night. And so they're so busy, and spirituality, forget about religion for a moment, but just, spirituality, having a connection, whether it's to God or to nature or to, to anything, to music, really doesn't matter what. But I found that with my students, as well as the members of the drug and alcohol groups who were also working a lot or dealing with a lot of drama in their lives. Maybe they had a bad experience in church. A lot of these people that I work with are Christian, identify as Christian. There was this gaping hole of spirituality. They never, there was never any time during the week where they just stopped and connected with something outside of themselves, something that was greater than them. And so I thought, when we're able to think about that and incorporate that into our lives, that makes such a huge difference in terms of meaning, in terms of purpose, in terms of, why do bad things happen to good people, coping, just giving that sense of meaning that I think gets in the way of an addiction or a compulsion. So, learning how to discover and then strengthen that spirituality muscle. Why am I here, right? What's the purpose of my life? So I feel really strongly that when it comes to treatment for addictions or compulsions, that we have to spend a lot of time empowering our clients or just people in general to think about the role of spirituality in their lives and then how to develop that, individually for them.
Yeah, yeah. Boy, that could lead into a lot more discussion here. Andy Matzner, what a interesting person you are. And I'm really grateful for having you be my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
David, listen, I have to thank you, and the pleasure is mine. I really appreciate having this opportunity.